Hello, my name is Megzy and welcome back to my channel. Today I will be doing a part 2 of my previous video of books that have influenced me as a reader, but this time I will be focusing on nonfiction. So this includes memoirs, personal essays, and some history books that have a little bit of political theory mixed in. And I will say that all of these books, as I said, have influenced me not just as a reader or even a writer, but they've also helped to kind of shape my worldview and personal belief system. So, without further ado, I think we should get started. But I will introduce you to a new friend we have here today. This is Miss Luna, and she will be helping me until she decides to bark at the person next door. So the first book I read many, many years ago, and I just loved because it is a series of personal essays that documents the beginning, middle, and disintegration of a relationship. Is called Essays in Love by Alain de Botton. I just gave that a French sounding name. I don't know if this is how you say his name. This is one of those books that it documents a relationship, but it really is the author's musings on love and analyzing romantic love and destiny and fate, all in a sort of philosophical lens, and also drawing parallels to love and religion, love and theories. And there's just some really wonderful quotes in here, and particularly on the first page, which I remember hooked me when I read this. I was like my mid-20s when I read this. Longing for a destiny is nowhere stronger than in a romantic life. All too often forced to share a bed with those who cannot fathom our soul, can we not be excused for believing, contrary to all the rules of our enlightened age, that we are fated one day to run into the man or woman of our dreams? Can we not be allowed a certain superstitious faith that we will ultimately locate a creature who can appease our painful yearnings? I love this book when I read it. I think a lot of people, though, have reviewed it as, please ignore her. This is probably like the first book I ever read that really analyzed romantic love and all of our preconceived notions that we get from media and pop culture and society about love and deconstructing it. I mean, maybe if I read this now, I think this guy was super pretentious and not really enjoy the way he treats his girlfriend. But yeah, Luna agrees. But I really enjoyed this otherwise. So if you are a true romantic at heart, I would recommend picking it up. The next book is kind of in a similar vein, but it is from more of a feminist analysis, and that is Bell Hooks' All About Love. Bell Hooks was a legendary, well-known, respected Black feminist. This book is, again, it is an analysis and deconstruction of romantic love, but she doesn't just focus on romantic love. She looks at all different forms of love, spiritual love, familial love, and she also analyzes and talks about what love is and isn't, and love in the context of an abusive relationship, which is not love. And there's a lot of also things I think that really focus on how both men and women are socialized and how we are socialized and how that comes out into our interpersonal relationships with each other. There are some great quotes. I mean, I tabbed the hell out of this when I read this, and this was years ago before I had any idea of being a booktuber, because there were so many great quotes in here. I think one of my favorite quotes was, "True love does not always lead to happily ever after, and even when it does, sustaining love still takes work. All relationships have ups and downs. Romantic fantasy often nurtures the belief that difficulties and downtimes are an indication of a lack of love rather than part of the process. In actuality, true love thrives on the difficulties." The next book, Memoir, actually, that I found really influential to me, Notes on a Foreign Country, An American Abroad in a Post-American World by Suzy Hansen. This was published in 2017. And Suzy Hansen she was an investigative journalist who ended up traveling and living in Turkey for a period of time, and she ended up actually staying permanently in Turkey. And so this, I think, grapples in general with the idea of American exceptionalism and America's foreign policy and how much America has an effect throughout the world, not necessarily for the best. And she also touches on, too, this idea of exporting democracies to other countries and how destructive that has been. She travels to so many other countries, mainly in the Middle East as well as Afghanistan. And I think this novel really is able to write about the things that Noam Chomsky and Edward Said have written about, but it writes about them in this way that is much more easily digestible and to the common person. And it's not a dry academic piece. It is a mixture of memoir and her own travel writing and history all rolled into one. And at the end of the novel, she touches on the 2016 election and how she sort of feels that people who are Trump supporters aren't really drastically different from your typical liberal American, even though they want to believe that, because we all have been sold this lie of American exceptionalism. It kind of acknowledges events at the end of the 2010s. Besides the 2016 election, we also have Erdogan's hold on power and ISIS and the Syrian refugee crisis. And so it really is beautifully written. It really makes you think. And to me, I think that, again, I think it's a way of really clearly dissecting and analyzing American exceptionalism and how much our foreign policy and meddling in other countries has been to other nations' detriment. I mean, this is a great read. I really love this. The title is also a nod to James Baldwin. The next book that this made me cry so hard at parts, but it is so good, is What is a Dog by Chloe Shaw. This is basically a memoir of the author's, all of the dogs that she had growing up, and she thinks back to how much their relationships with her really influenced her and had such an effect on her life, and what they taught her about herself and her capacity for love. I mean, if you are any kind of pet lover, specifically if you're a dog lover, I think you would really love this. I think the great tragedy, though, of having a dog or any kind of pet really, is just that you unfortunately know you're probably going to outlive it. And that is just one of the most difficult, cruelest things. I mean, I read this before I got my own dog sitting over there, Harley. Luna is my boyfriend's dog. And, but reading this brought back memories of losing my family dog. And I was crying. This just definitely for all dog lovers, I will say. And it's a beautifully, articulately written a tribute to all the dogs in her life and how much she loved them, how much they had an impact on her life. And I mean, I would love to, honestly, personally, someday write something like this. The final book I will be discussing, I don't own, but this is a memoir, is Nancy Jo Sales' Nothing Personal, My Life in the Dating App Inferno. This I read last year from the library. It is about a 49-year-old woman, Nancy Jo Sales, who her marriage disintegrates and she decides to download Tinder, and she goes on this wild experiment of meeting and dating and sleeping with these 20-somethings on Tinder. And because Nancy Jo Sales is from an older generation, I think she was born in 1964. So she is a boomer, but she also sits on the cusp of Gen X. this whole idea of online dating the way it is now with swiping and also hookup culture, this is all very new to her. And so it's very personal. It especially documents this relationship she has with a younger man who's 25, and he strings her along, but in this way that doesn't feel deliberately cruel, but is unintentionally cruel. And she really analyzes just how misogyny presents itself today. She even compares how millennial men have a certain kind of misogyny that can differ from baby boomer men. She interviews other women who also have been through the same thing. I did enjoy the chapter where she does actually she talks about how it is to date as a woman of color and also to date as a queer woman. And so I did like that the bulk of the piece, I think, is obviously on her own experiences. She is a white middle-aged woman, but I did like that there at least was a nod to some intersectionality. She touches a lot on the manosphere online, on incels. It's a really fascinating documentation, I think, of any millennial and Gen Z person, I think, will really relate to this, particularly if you're a woman. I thought that this was really well done, and I think sometimes older generations don't quite get it with both like hookup culture as well as technology and how these have fused together, and not necessarily always for the best in our interpersonal romantic relationships. And how I think like the sexual revolution, well, there was a lot of really good things that came of it. It's still kind of, I think, got kind of co-opted, I would say, in a way that doesn't really feel empowering. So I really loved this memoir, and I related to a lot of it, and I think it was really nice to see someone from an older generation actually empathize with what younger generations are going through, because I also feel like that's not something you generally encounter. I think older generations generally are like, oh, suck it up, like you didn't have it as hard as I do. And each generation outside of dating, like to talk about like economic issues, has their own issues that they have to grapple with. So I definitely recommend this. Okay, so I lied because that finished my memoir section. Now we are going to get into more standard nonfiction books that are about real people, real events, political theories, history, all that fun stuff. So I will start with the lightest book that I have in this collection, and that is Ava Gardner, Love is Nothing by Lee Server. I have read quite a bit of old Hollywood biographies of primarily actresses. And this, by far, is my favorite. It's not so much that I am a huge Ava Gardner fan. I mean, I like her as an icon. Her movies leave a little bit to be desired. But I just think the way that this was written and how much her essence and complexities as a person, and also the description of the studio system, specifically MGM, which was the most powerful, influential studio where Ava was a contract player, and also watching its slow decline. Ava was born in 1922 and she died in 1990. And so she lived like a huge chunk. I mean, her entire life is basically all of the events, almost all of the events of the 20th century. And it's so fascinating. I especially loved too how even though Gardner was never really considered a serious actress, Lee Server really did give attention to her films, the filmmaking process, and gives some analysis of her films as well. I feel like sometimes in a way, like I've read biographies of other actresses that they weren't serious actresses, and so there wasn't really like a lot of consideration given to their roles, or even like how those films performed at the box office, how they impacted people, how people reacted, the public reacted. And I do like that he does go over every single film she was in. She acted in quite a bit of film noirs, and then later on, she did actually become a pretty decent actress. Her life is so interesting. She had 3 marriages. She's most famously known for being married to Frank Sinatra. And like I said, this to me just has like everything that I want in an old Hollywood biography. There's a lot of acknowledgement of gossip. I mean, she had a wild life too. She was very much a party girl, very promiscuous, just did whatever she wanted, definitely was deeply troubled, but I don't think she ever wanted to see herself as a victim. She had this really kind of resilience to her and independence. I really enjoy this autobiography. The next nonfiction book I will be discussing that did have a really big impact on me, at least when I was in high school, was She's a Rebel, The History of Women in Rock and Roll. This is by Gillian G. Gaar. Has a preface by Yoko Ono. So this, I think, was published, there were several editions, and the first edition was in 1992, and I have, I think, the second edition, which is from 2002. So this only goes up to 2002. This is a much needed analysis and tribute to women who created and have their place in not just rock music, but it covers so many other genres. Rock and roll's early roots, from when it took from African American music to pop stars to Madonna. She analyzes, I mean, everyone from like Courtney Love to Gwen Stefani to Patti Smith to the Riot Girl movement, Salt and Pepper. I mean, there is some space given to women in hip hop because, like I said, even though it is called Women in Rock, it covers so many different genres. Basically, it should just be called The History of Women in Music in the 20th Century. And I loved this so much as a teenager because I felt like there was a period in my life where I only listened to female artists, and I was really into like rock bands that were fronted by women or were primarily made up of women. And so, yeah, this book was definitely influential to me. I think like I even used some of it in like my high school thesis. I just love the way she tells stories about each individual woman. Anyone who's a fan of like music history, I think will really appreciate this. The next book, I said I'm gonna go from like fluffiest to the most deep thinking, is The Devil's Chessboard, Allen Dulles, the CIA, and the Rise of America's Secret Government. This looks so beat up because I took it to the beach, and also my boyfriend had it for a period of time. This basically is a very in-depth historical overview of the foundations of the CIA, Allen Dulles, who is the head of the CIA, and the CIA's formation under the Truman presidency. And there's a lot of really fascinating and also terrifying information in here. He talks about how, I mean, maybe this is common knowledge by now, but how the CIA was actually formed by certain people who were ex-Nazis. I think when people talk about, like you hear right-wingers talk about the deep state, it's not, I mean, they're not entirely wrong, but there is some truth in what they're saying. They just don't really have quite of like the language or like the analysis to really formulate that thought, I guess you could say. And I mean, there's a lot of really in-depth overview also of the early CIA coups, the CIA coup of 1953 of Iran with Mossadegh, and the 1954 coup in Guatemala. And I mean, at the heart of this, there's a lot of focus on Kennedy. And I think that was only my one complaint. Not that I don't find Kennedy to be fascinating, but I feel like the author kind of lionizes Kennedy and makes him sound a little more radical and leftist than he was. It definitely gets a little bit into the conspiracy theory land with like the CIA was behind Kennedy's assassination. And I mean, I think it's honestly possible. But yeah, I mean, Allen Dulles was he was a piece of work. He was a nasty man. But this is just a really interesting and critical eye of our government and shadow wars and coups and all of that. It's fascinating, and it's very easily digestible. I feel like Noam Chomsky mentions a lot of this stuff, but it's much more easily readable to the average reader, because I feel like when I'm reading someone like Chomsky, I really have to use my brain. And the next book, speaking of the devil, why not? I will mention Noam Chomsky. I think he was very influential in my understanding, really, of foreign policy, American foreign policy. Also, just how like power systems are all interconnected, and kind of stepping back and looking at like the bigger picture as to how like these elaborate systems are all feed into each other. The book I have here is called Power Systems, Conversations on Global Democratic Uprisings and the New Challenge to U.S. Empire. So this is not like a heavy, dense text. This is actually conversations. There are interviews, various interviews taken with him, where he just explains his thoughts on a lot of it is actually current events at that time in the early to mid 2010s. So there is space given to the Arab Spring as well as Occupy Wall Street. But if I had to pick like a Chomsky book, I think that influenced me the most, I would actually pick this one. I have read Profit Over People, and I have also read like half of Manufacturing Consent. Manufacturing Consent, although interesting, it honestly put me to sleep. So I would say Chomsky was definitely a big eye-opener into just really seeing the world outside of this like very myopic, like liberals versus conservatives, Democrats versus Republicans, and really like stepping back and looking at the bigger picture. Another person that I think also really influenced me in my understanding was Edward Said. This is a collection of a lot of his writings. The Edward Said Reader, edited by Moustafa, Bayoumi, and Andrew Rubin. I have not read this actually like cover to cover, but there are a lot of really wonderful essays in here. And he was a professor who taught at Columbia, and I think he was of Palestinian and Lebanese descent. He was born in Mandatory Palestine, and he was one of the first intellectuals to really bring light to the plight of the Palestinians, and also to question how the media and academic language surrounding the Middle East and the Far East, how it is phrased in this very like East versus West. And so when we think of like decolonial analysis, people who were under European colonization, who in many ways that colonization never really ended, it just sort of took new forms. He is definitely one of like the most influential decolonial analysis. I think for me personally, it's also it's important to read him, even though it is like academic and heavy. I mean, there's a ton of footnotes. He really like fact checked his stuff. But I think even because I am part Lebanese myself, it was just nice to see this like different analysis of the Middle East in a way that I don't think I really had presented to me, especially someone who grew up in the 2000s during the War on Terror, and people from the Middle East are just like, outside of Israel, just seen as like savages. And so that, I think for me, he really like deepened my understanding, I want to say, of the world. And the last book I will be discussing, and I feel like I have to pull this up because I want to give justice to this book, is Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. I don't own this. I got it from the library, and I read it several years ago. And it was a really good critique, eye-opening critique and history of neoliberal capitalism and Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics, and how that has impacted economies throughout the world, but also noting how when some sort of disaster, whether it is man-made like a war or a natural disaster like Hurricane Katrina, that companies and investors come in and use that disaster to their advantage to build up their own interests. And I mean, we can see this in Hurricane Katrina and how so many people were displaced. The like indigenous Black population who were more poor and working class. And then after that, you see this massive gentrification that happens in New Orleans. There's a lot of talk too of focus on Latin America and Chile in specific. And it was really eye-opening. I mean, she definitely writes in a way I think that is also very accessible, and so I definitely would recommend it. I know she is not everyone's cup of tea because, I mean, whatever, if you think capitalism is great and perfect, then you will not like this. I read this and I felt definitely deeply affected by it. But I also, at the same time, I mean, I read this at the end of 2020, and so maybe it was not like the best time to read this, but it's definitely eye opening, and I definitely want to read more of her work because she really covers a lot of events also too that happened during the fall of the Soviet Union, and I think like what we call like the end of history. And yeah, if you ever wonder about like the wealth gap and the economy and things just being hard for the average person, it didn't just originate with COVID. This is something that has been going on for decades. Generally, we think of like the neoliberal era, starting with Reagan and Thatcher. So yeah, I highly recommend. Again, I recommend all these books because for me, they definitely had an influence on shaping my worldview, at least also shaping too my reading and even my writing. So yeah, that's it. That's the end. Those are all my favorite, not favorite, but most influential nonfiction books I have read. And I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.